He drove his daughter to the ER at 5 in the morning. By 9, they fired him in front of everyone he worked with. But nobody expected what happened next. 5:45 in the morning. His daughter can barely breathe. Every second matters, and he has already made up his mind. Nothing else exists right now but getting her to safety. 40 minutes late. No badge, no phone. Just a father who spent the entire morning in an emergency room, running now to make it right before anyone notices. You are dismissed, effective immediately. 6 years of loyalty, erased in under 90 seconds, because nobody bothered to ask him why. 3 years ago, a stranger pulled someone Marcus loved out of a burning car in the middle of a blizzard and vanished before anyone could say thank you. Today, Marcus finally recognized his face. The last thing David Bennett expected on a Tuesday morning was to be fired in front of 40 of his coworkers by a woman who did not even know his daughter's name. But before you see how his story ends, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens in the next few minutes will remind you why some people are worth fighting for. Stay until the very end, because the ending will stay with you long after the video is over. David Bennett was 34 years old, a former Army combat medic who had traded a war zone for a warehouse floor, and traded uncertainty for the one thing that mattered most to him now: his 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Since his wife passed away 2 years earlier, David had rebuilt his entire life around one small girl with 2 missing front teeth and a laugh that could fill an empty house. He worked as a logistics supervisor at Meridian Dynamics, a mid-sized shipping and technology firm, and in 6 years, he had never once called out sick, never missed a deadline, and never raised his voice at a single soul on the floor. Before Meridian Dynamics, David had spent 8 years in the Army, 4 of them overseas as a combat medic attached to an infantry unit that saw more than its share of dust, gunfire, and long silences afterward. He had held hands he could not save and closed eyes that would never open again. And he had promised himself, somewhere in a field hospital tent halfway across the world, that if he made it home, he would build a life so ordinary and so steady that his daughter would never have to know what chaos truly felt like. His wife, Angela, had been the one who convinced him to leave the service, who told him there was a different kind of courage in staying home and showing up every single day for the people who loved him. When Angela died of a sudden aneurysm 2 years into Lily's life, David did not fall apart, not where anyone could see it. He simply rearranged the entire architecture of his existence around one small, stubborn, giggling girl who needed her father more than the world needed another soldier. On the morning, everything changed. David woke at 4:45 a.m. to the sound of Lily wheezing in her bed. Her asthma had flared before, but never like this. Her small chest rattled with every breath, her lips turning a pale shade of blue in the dim nightlight glow. David did not panic. 6 years in the Army had trained the panic out of him. He scooped her into his arms, grabbed her inhaler and her stuffed rabbit, and drove through empty streets to the emergency room, running 2 red lights he would later admit to no one. The next 3 hours blurred into fluorescent lights, oxygen masks, and a nurse's steady voice telling him Lily was going to be fine. By the time the doctors stabilized her breathing and released them with a new prescription, it was almost 8 in the morning. David's phone, which he had forgotten to charge the night before in his rush to soothe his daughter, had died somewhere between the second nebulizer treatment and the parking garage. He had no way to call his supervisor, no way to send the text he always sent when something came up. He dropped Lily at his elderly neighbor's apartment, promised he would be back before lunch, and drove straight to Meridian Dynamics, still wearing yesterday's shirt, his badge forgotten on the kitchen counter in the chaos of the morning. He walked in at 9:20, 40 minutes late, disheveled, exhausted, and desperate to explain himself to anyone who would listen. What he did not know was that today, of all days, the company's new CEO, Vanessa Cole, had chosen to conduct a surprise walkthrough of the warehouse floor. The people on that warehouse floor knew David in ways that no HR file ever could. They knew him as the supervisor who memorized every employee's kid's birthday and left a card taped to their locker. They knew him as the man who had once driven 45 minutes in a snowstorm to bring a stranded coworker a spare battery so she would not miss her shift and lose a day's pay she could not afford to lose. They knew him as someone who never asked anyone to do something he had not already done himself, whether that meant hauling the heaviest pallets or staying past midnight during the holiday rush. To them, David Bennett was not a line item on a spreadsheet. He was the reason the floor felt less like a warehouse and more like a family, and that was precisely why what happened next would hit so many of them so hard. Vanessa Cole had taken over Meridian Dynamics 8 months earlier, brought in by the board after a hostile transition to cut costs, tighten discipline, and restore investor confidence following a rocky quarter. She was brilliant, relentless, and, according to almost everyone who worked beneath her, terrifying. She believed that structure was kindness and that exceptions were the beginning of chaos. She had grown up believing that weakness was something you buried, not something you explained, and she ran her company the same way she had run her own grief for years, with her chin up and her heart locked away. What almost nobody at Meridian Dynamics knew was that Vanessa Cole had clawed her way up from a childhood where her own single mother had been fired from. 3 separate jobs for reasons that were never fully explained to her, always some version of not being reliable enough, not being flexible enough, not fitting the mold the company needed. Vanessa had promised herself as a teenager that she would never again be on the powerless side of a boardroom door, and somewhere along the way, in the process of becoming powerful, she had convinced herself that toughness and fairness were the same thing. The board had brought her in specifically because she did not flinch, because she could walk into a room of frightened employees and deliver bad news without her voice shaking. Nobody had ever taught her that the same steadiness that made her effective in a crisis could also make her blind to the human being standing directly in front of her. That morning, Vanessa arrived on the warehouse floor flanked by 2 board members she was desperate to impress. Walking the aisles with a clipboard, silently noting every flaw, every late clock in, every open box left unsorted. When she reached David's station and found it empty at 9 o'clock sharp, she asked the nearest employee where the supervisor was. Nobody had an answer, because nobody had one to give. David simply had not been there, and in Vanessa Cole's mind, an empty station on inspection day was not a mystery to solve. It was a failure to punish. David arrived 20 minutes later, hurrying through the loading bay doors, his badge missing, his shirt untucked, his eyes rimmed red from a sleepless night. He saw Vanessa Cole standing exactly where he needed to be standing, and his stomach dropped. "Mr. Bennett, I presume," Vanessa said, her voice carrying across the open floor with the practiced precision of someone who had learned that authority sounds better when it echoes. 40 minutes late. No badge, no call, no explanation on file. "Would you like to tell me why I should not fire you on the spot?" David opened his mouth to explain, his voice catching as he tried to find the words for his daughter's blue lips and the hospital lights and the phone that had died in his pocket. "My daughter, she had an asthma attack. I had to take her to the emergency room. I tried to call, but my phone—" "I don't need excuses, Mr. Bennett," Vanessa cut in, her tone sharpening in front of the gathering crowd of employees who had stopped their work to watch. "Everyone here has a story. Everyone here has a reason. If I accepted every story, this company would fall apart. You are dismissed, effective immediately. Security will escort you out." A young forklift operator named Tasha, barely 2 years into the job and still finding her footing, felt her hands begin to shake on the controls. She had transferred to David's shift 6 months earlier after a difficult stretch in her personal life. And it was David who had quietly adjusted her schedule around her night classes without ever making her feel like she owed him for it. She wanted to speak up, wanted to tell this woman in the expensive suit that she had no idea what she was talking about. But 18 years of learning to stay quiet in front of authority kept her rooted to the spot. Her jaw clenched, her eyes stinging with a helpless kind of anger. The warehouse went silent, except for the distant hum of the conveyor belts. 40 employees stood frozen, watching a man who had covered their shifts, who had driven through snowstorms to open the loading dock, who had once given his own coat to a new hire caught without one in the winter cold, being stripped of his dignity in under 90 seconds. Someone near the back whispered that this wasn't right. Nobody said it loud enough for Vanessa to hear. David did not argue further. He had learned long ago, in places far more dangerous than a warehouse floor, that dignity sometimes meant knowing when a battle could not be won in the moment. He nodded once, swallowed the lump rising in his throat, and turned toward the exit as 2 security officers approached to walk him out, as was standard company procedure for any immediate termination. The lead security officer that morning was a man named Marcus Alvarez, a broad-shouldered former Marine who had worked at Meridian Dynamics for 3 years and had a memory sharper than most people gave him credit for. As Marcus stepped forward to take David by the arm, per protocol, something in his mind clicked into place. He stopped walking. He stared at David's face for a long moment, the exhaustion, the scar along his jawline, the way he held his shoulders even in defeat. "Wait," Marcus said quietly, almost to himself. Then, louder, turning to Vanessa Cole. "Ma'am, I need a minute before we do this." Vanessa frowned, unaccustomed to being told to wait by anyone. "Excuse me?" 3 years ago," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm, loud enough now for the gathered employees to hear. "On Route 9, there was a multi-car accident during an ice storm. A truck jackknifed and pinned a sedan against the guardrail. I was off duty, driving home. I couldn't get the door open. There was a woman trapped inside, unconscious, and a man ran across 3 lanes of stopped traffic in the middle of a blizzard, pulled a tire iron out of his own trunk, broke the window, and pulled her out 30 seconds before that car caught fire." Marcus paused, looking directly at David. "That man was you, wasn't it?" David said nothing, but something in his tired eyes answered for him. "I've spent 3 years trying to find out who that guy was," Marcus continued. "He left before the ambulance even arrived. Didn't want credit. Didn't leave his name. I only recognized you now because I never forgot that face." Marcus turned back to Vanessa. "Ma'am, that woman he pulled out of the car was my sister-in-law. She's alive today. She has 2 kids, because this man risked his life for a stranger on the side of the road and asked for nothing in return. And you're firing him because his daughter had an asthma attack and his phone died." A murmur rippled through the crowd. One of the board members standing beside Vanessa exchanged an uneasy glance with the other. Vanessa Cole, for the first time in longer than she could remember, found herself without a rehearsed response. "That's a moving story. Officer Alvarez," she said finally, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "But company policy exists for a reason. I can't run a business on sentiment." "With respect, ma'am," Marcus said, stepping slightly between David and the exit, not quite blocking it, but close enough that the message was unmistakable. "Policy is supposed to protect people, not punish them for things outside their control. This man has a 6-year-old daughter with no mother. He drove her to the ER at 5 in the morning and still made it to work before 10. That's not a discipline problem. That's a man doing everything right in an impossible situation." Vanessa Cole stood in the center of the warehouse floor, 40 employees watching, 2 board members waiting to see what she would do next, and for the first time since taking this job, she felt the cold architecture of her own rules pressing back against her. She thought, unbidden, of her own son, Ethan, 11 years old now, and the year she had missed nearly every school recital because she was terrified that if she stopped moving, stopped proving herself, the company and everything she'd built would collapse the way her marriage once had. She looked at David Bennett, really looked at him, and asked the question she should have asked 20 minutes earlier. "What is your daughter's name?" It was such a small question, 4 words that cost her nothing to ask, and yet it was the first time in the entire encounter that she had asked David anything at all instead of simply telling him what he was. David lifted his head, surprised by the question. "Lily," he said quietly. "Her name is Lily. She's 6. Vanessa nodded slowly. She turned to the human resources director who had trailed her onto the floor, silent through the entire encounter. "Pull his file, now. I want to see his attendance record for the last 5 years." It took less than 4 minutes for HR to return with a tablet showing David's employment history, 0 unexcused absences in 6 years, 3 commendations from floor supervisors, a note from 2 years earlier when he had stayed 4 extra hours unpaid to help train new hires during a holiday rush, all while grieving his wife's death that same month. There was also, buried in the system, a missed call logged from David's cell number at 5:52 that morning to the after-hours supervisor line, a call that had gone unanswered because the line had not been properly staffed that week, a detail nobody in the room had known until now. Vanessa Cole read the screen twice. Then she looked up at David, and for the first time that morning, her voice lost its edge entirely. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "I made a mistake, and I made it in front of everyone who works for you, which means I owe you an apology in front of everyone who works for you." She turned to address the floor, her voice carrying the way it had before, except now it did not sound like authority. It sounded like accountability. "This morning I terminated an employee based on incomplete information and my own impatience. That was wrong. Mr. Bennett is reinstated, effective immediately, with full back pay for today, and I will be personally reviewing our emergency leave policy this week, because no parent in this company should ever have to choose between their child's safety and their job." The 2 board members who had accompanied Vanessa that morning exchanged a long look as the applause rippled across the floor, the kind of look that said more than either of them would have dared to say aloud in front of the staff. One of them, a quiet man named Harold Whitfield, who had sat on the board for nearly 2 decades, would later tell Vanessa privately that in all his years watching executives manage crises, he had never once seen a leader publicly reverse a decision and come out of it looking stronger rather than weaker. It was not the firing that would define her tenure at Meridian Dynamics, he told her. It was the 11 seconds of silence before she asked David for his daughter's name, and everything she chose to do afterward. The warehouse floor, silent moments before, erupted into quiet applause, the kind that starts uncertain and grows as people realize it is safe to believe in something good happening in front of them. David stood frozen for a moment, unsure if this was real, before Marcus placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Go home, man," Marcus said. "Go check on your daughter. We'll hold the floor down." Vanessa Cole did not simply let the moment pass as a single act of damage control. Over the following weeks, she instituted a company-wide policy allowing verified medical emergencies involving dependents to be excused without penalty, no matter how the notification arrived. She personally visited the warehouse floor twice a month afterward, not with a clipboard, but with actual questions for the people doing the work. She quietly arranged, without ever telling David directly, for Lily's ongoing asthma treatment costs to be covered under an expanded company health benefit, care of a policy change that would help dozens of other families long after David's story faded from office conversation. 6 months later, David Bennett stood in the same warehouse, no longer just a supervisor, but the newly appointed head of workplace safety and family support programs, a position created specifically because of what had happened that Tuesday morning. Lily's asthma was under control, her medication adjusted, her nights peaceful. She had started kindergarten with a new backpack her father had saved 3 paychecks to buy, and every single day, without fail, David was there at pickup, standing by the fence with his hands in his pockets and the widest smile in the schoolyard. Vanessa Cole, for her part, learned something that no business school had ever taught her, that the people running the numbers were never just numbers themselves, that every empty station on a warehouse floor had a story behind it worth asking about before judging it. and that real leadership was not about how tightly you held control, but about how honestly you were willing to admit when you had gotten it wrong. She began arriving early enough some mornings to walk her own son to school, something she had not done in years. One Saturday morning, not long after the policy changes took effect, Vanessa Cole sat across from her son Ethan at the kitchen table, both of them still in pajamas. Something that had not happened in longer than either of them could remember. Ethan asked her, in the blunt way only an 11-year-old can manage, why she seemed different lately, less tired around the eyes. Vanessa thought about David Bennett, about Lily, about the warehouse floor, and the 11 seconds of silence before she had asked a simple question. She should have asked from the very beginning. She told her son that she had learned, a little late, but not too late, that being strong and being kind were never supposed to be opposites, and that the people who worked hardest for her deserved a boss who remembered that they were people first and employees second. David Bennett never wanted recognition for pulling a stranger from a burning car, and he never wanted pity for being a single father raising a daughter alone. All he ever wanted was to be seen for who he actually was. A man who showed up, who did the hard things quietly, who put his daughter first even when it cost him everything, and who, in the end, was given back the dignity that should never have been taken from him in the first place. If this story moved you even a little, remember that behind every empty desk, every late clock in, every person who looks like they are struggling, there might be a story you have not asked about yet. Take the time to ask. You never know whose life you might be standing in front of. Somewhere right now, there is another David walking into another building, carrying a knight nobody else can see. And there's another Vanessa, standing at a crossroads between the easy judgment and the harder, better question. The difference between the two paths is rarely dramatic. It is usually just a single sentence, asked with a little more patience than the moment seems to deserve. If you believe stories like David's deserve to be told and shared, make sure you are subscribed, drop a comment telling us what part of this story hit you the hardest, and we will see you in the next one.